The knock came just before dark, when Magnus Ford had reached the end of his patience for the day and was still 2 hours short of the end of the work. He heard it from the forge, a clean, firm rap on the front door, not the uncertain tapping of a child or the fist hammering of a man with a complaint. He set down the tongs, wiped his hands on the leather apron, and went through the side door of the smithy into the house. The kitchen was empty and cold. The cook stove had gone out again. There were dirty tin cups on the table and a heel of bread left without wrapping, which meant it would be hard by morning. He noted these things the way he noted everything these days, with a dull, heavy awareness that had replaced, over the past 2 years, the feeling of a man who lived in a home rather than a building he slept inside. He opened the front door. The woman standing on the step was not young and she was not soft-looking, but she was neat in a way that suggested considerable effort rather than ease. Her dark dress was worn at the elbows but clean, and she wore it straight. She held a carpet bag in one hand and a folded square of paper in the other, and she looked at him directly, without flinching from his size or the suit on his face. "Mr. Ford," she said, "I'm Maud Sefton. I've come about the housekeeper position." Magnus stared at her. He had put a notice in the window of Grundy's Dry Goods 3 weeks ago, and then largely forgotten he had done it, because no one in Iron Hollow had shown the remotest interest, and he had concluded that no one would. "Come in," he said. She came in. She looked at the cold stove and the dirty cups and the heel of bread with an expression not of judgment but of inventory. "Who told you about the position?" he asked. "I read the notice at Grundy's." She set the carpet bag beside the door, not in the middle of the floor where it would be in the way. "I've been looking for a place. I understand you have children." "3," he said. "They can be a handful." "Children usually are." She held out the folded paper. I brought a reference. "Mrs. Holden in Cedar Falls. She'll speak for me." He took the paper and did not open it, because he could not read well in the low light and would not admit it. "Why did you leave Cedar Falls?" he said. Something moved behind her eyes, just briefly. The family relocated. There was no position for me to follow to. He looked at her more carefully. She was perhaps 35, with dark hair going to grey at the temples and a face that had been lived in, not pretending to be anything it wasn't. There was something careful in her stillness that he recognized, the stillness of a person who had learned to take up as little space as possible in a room. He had heard things about a woman named Sefton. He could not remember exactly what, only the tone in which they had been said. "Can you cook?" he said. "Yes." "And manage a house?" "Yes." "I'll start in the morning, if that suits you," she said. "Tonight I'll see to the stove and what there is for supper, and we can discuss terms when we've both had a look at what needs doing." He said yes before he had quite decided to, because the kitchen behind him was cold, and he was a man running out of ways to hold it all together. Maud Sefton lit the stove in less time than he would have managed it himself. She had come to Iron Hollow with exactly $11 and a reference she did not fully trust, because the truth behind leaving Cedar Falls was not the relocation of any family. The truth was Mrs. Aldrich. Mrs. Aldrich was the wife of Iron Hollow's leading merchant, and she had spread a story about Maud Sefton that was wrong and mean and effective. The story had gotten to Cedar Falls ahead of Maud's application, to Millbrook before that. By the time Maud walked into Iron Hollow, it had preceded her to every respectable house in town. Mrs. Holden's letter was genuine, but was not enough to counter a whisper campaign 2 years in the making. The story was about a man, the son of a family she had worked for. He had pursued her, she had declined. He had told a version that made her the villain, and his mother had believed him, and his mother knew Mrs. Aldrich, and there it was. Maud Sefton had done nothing wrong. She had no way to prove it, and the proving did not seem to matter to anyone in Iron Hollow. The Grundys' notice had been the last notice she had seen. The blacksmith's house was the last door she had not yet tried. She put the soup on, set the table, and waited. The children came in just before it was ready, 2 boys and a girl, their faces unwashed, their clothes serviceable but needing mending. They stopped in the doorway and looked at her the way children look at something new, wary, assessing. "Supper's on," she said. "Wash your hands at the pump." The older boy said, "You're not our ma." "No," she said, "I'm not. Wash your hands." There was a pause. Then he went to the pump. The younger 2 followed. Magnus came in from the smithy and stood in the kitchen doorway a moment, as though adjusting to the fact that supper existed. Maud ladled the soup and set the bread on the table and took her own place, and that first supper was quiet except for spoons, and the younger boy asking what was in the soup, and the girl saying it was better than the last time, which meant better than anything recent, which Maud understood and did not say. After supper she washed the dishes, noted the mending pile in the back room, and went to bed in the small room at the top of the stairs. She lay in the dark and thought about $11 and the morning. The morning was where she had always found her footing, one thing at a time. Magnus sat in the smithy after the house went quiet and let the story about the Sefton woman come back to him. Mrs. Aldrich had been very certain about it. Half the town had closed their doors. He had not paid attention at the time. He had been buried in grief and the bare minimum of keeping 3 children fed. Now he thought about the neat dress and the direct look and the kitchen that smelled warm when he came in for supper. He thought about the older boy's face during the meal, the worriness easing slightly as the bowl emptied. He had been a fair man before. He did not think grief had made him unfair exactly, but he had grown narrow, the way a man grows narrow when he is spending everything he has just to get through the day. He had not asked enough questions. He had not asked any questions at all. He went to sleep thinking about the reference letter he had not opened. The next morning he opened it. It was what she had said. It was straightforward, warm, specific. He went to Grundy's that afternoon because he needed bolts and because he found himself wanting to know something more. He asked the question carefully, without saying who it was for. Aldrich woman's had it in for her since she left the Payne household, Grundy said. That's all I know for certain. What she says Sefton did, I never saw any proof of it. Magnus bought his bolts and went home with the matter settled in his mind, though he said nothing about it yet. A man who had been wrong about something important did not always rush to announce it. He filed it away and watched. Maud had been in the house 4 days when she got to the mending pile. The children were watching, she knew, the way children who have been hurt watch anything new, waiting for it to go wrong. She did not push. She was there, and the meals were on time, and the house was warm. She mended steadily through the afternoon, and the youngest, who was called B, sat across from her with the careful curiosity of a small creature deciding whether a thing was safe. "What are you sewing?" B asked. "Your brother's shirt. The seam came out at the shoulder." B considered this. "I used to do that," she said. "I know," Maud said. "That's what I'm here for." "You're not, Ma." "No, sweetheart, I'm not." Maud kept her needle moving. "But I'm here." That seemed to be enough. B slid off her chair and came to sit beside Maud on the bench, close, but not quite touching, and watched the needle go in and out of the worn flannel. Maud did not reach for her. She let the child make her own distance or close it. After a while, B leaned her head against Maud's arm and did not say anything else. Magnus saw it from the doorway and went back to the smithy without speaking. He stood at the anvil for a full minute before he could work again. His wife, Clara, had been dead 2 years and 3 months. She had gone in a fever that came fast and left no room for much beyond shock. He had been left with 3 children, a smithy, and a grief that had no clean edges. He was not a cold man. He had been warm once, easy with laughter, the kind who could sit on the porch of an evening and feel entirely at home. That man had not gone away entirely. He had only gone quiet, gone deep under the weight of daily surviving, buried under orders and deliveries, and the particular exhaustion of being both mother and father and falling short at both. He had not expected to feel anything watching a woman sew his son's shirt. He had not expected the thing in his chest at the sight of his youngest daughter leaning against a near stranger's arm. He worked the iron and did not think about. The trouble from town came in the second week, when Maud went to Grundy's for flour and found Mrs. Aldrich looking at her from across the aisle, as though Maud were something tracked in on someone's boot. "I hear you've found a situation," Mrs. Aldrich said. "I have," Maud said. "Magnus Ford." The mouth went small. "He's too busy to know better, I suppose. Those poor motherless children deserve someone decent." Maud had spent 2 years being looked through and talked over. She had gotten very good at a particular kind of stillness. "He is someone decent," Maud said, "and so am I." She took her flour and her change and went out without haste. She went home the long way, through the alley behind the tannery, and stood there a minute in the cold with the flour sack in her arms, because she was not made of iron however much she tried to be, and there was a point past which a person could not hold everything in without a seam giving way. She took her minute, then she squared her shoulders and went home and made supper. Magnus heard about it from Grundy 3 days later, matter of fact as a weather report. He went home, found Maud taking bread from the oven, and stood in the kitchen doorway. "I heard you ran into Mrs. Aldrich," he said. "It wasn't a remarkable event," she said. "What she's been saying about you," he said. "I talked to Grundy. I talked to Harvey Payne's hired man." He paused. "Maud." She looked at him. "It wasn't true," he said. "Not quite a question." "No," she said. "It wasn't." He nodded slowly. "I know," he said. Something shifted in her face, not relief exactly, but the expression of a woman who has been carrying something alone for a long time and has just been told she does not have to. "Thank you," she said. "You don't need to thank me for believing what's true," he said, and went back to the smithy. She stood with her hands on the bread rack for a full minute and let herself feel what that was worth. The weeks after were different in small ways, not dramatic. Magnus Ford was not a man for drama, and she was not a woman for it, but the small ways were real. He lingered in the kitchen doorway in the evenings rather than disappearing after supper. He brought firewood without being asked. He told her, one morning, that the bread was the best he'd eaten since Clara, and said the name without flinching, which seemed to cost him something, and which she understood as a kind of trust. She began to tell him things in those doorway conversations, not about Mrs. Aldrich, not about Cedar Falls, but about before all of that. The Missouri town where she had grown up, her father the school teacher, who had died leaving nothing but debts and a good example. The years she had spent in service, in households that were decent and some that were not, the way she had always been better at managing a house than at the other things women were supposed to want for themselves. She said it without self-pity. It was simply the shape of her life, and she had made her peace with most of it. He listened with the attention of a man who had grown unused to listening and was finding, to his own surprise, that he had missed it. He told her, in return, about Clara, carefully testing the weight of each word before he spoke it, about the way Clara had sung to the children at night, about the year before she died, when the smithy had kept them both busy and they had been so tired in the evenings that they had sat side by side without talking and found that enough, about the way the house had felt off-key after she was gone, the way a song is off-key when one voice drops out. Maud listened without trying to fill every silence. "It's been good," he said, one evening in the 5th week, not looking directly at her, "having you here. Good for the children." "They're fine children," she said. "They're coming back to themselves." He looked at her then. "It's been good for me too," he said. "I should say that plainly." She did not answer quickly. She let the silence sit. The way most things have their space, and then she said, "You've been decent to me when you didn't have to be, and I know what that's worth." She paused. "I've been glad to be here, more glad than I expected." The crisis came in the 6th week, a Sunday, when Magnus had taken the wagon to town and left her with the children. She was in the kitchen garden when she heard the argument through the back window. Ely, the oldest, 12 years old, had been in a fight at the neighbor's yard over something the neighbor's boy had said about Maud, about why she was there, about what it meant, a ruined woman living in the Ford house. Ely had come home with a split lip and his chin up. Maud sat down across the table from him and looked at him steadily. "You don't fight my battles," she said, "not because they aren't real, because I fight them myself. And I don't want you carrying my trouble on top of your own." His jaw set. He shouldn't have said it. No, he shouldn't. His parents will hear from yours about that, and that is the proper way. But I want you to know something, Ely. I know what they say about me in this town. It's not true. The people who matter will find that out in time. He had Clara's eyes, dark and deep-set, with a steadiness remarkable in a 12-year-old. "Pa believes you," he said. "I know he does." "I believe you too," he said. She put her hand over his briefly. "Good," she said. "Now let me see to that lip." Magnus came home to a house where the lip had been tended, a note had been sent to the neighbor's father, and supper was on. Ely told him the story that night, and Magnus stood in the kitchen afterward with his hands at his sides, and looked at Maud across the table. "He's a good boy," she said. "He is," Magnus said. "He takes after his mother." She nodded. He said, "You take it on. Everything this town throws at you, you stand up straight." "I've had practice," she said. He crossed the kitchen, the way he moved when he had decided something, unhurried, certain. He stopped across the table from her and said, "I don't want you going anywhere." She looked up at him. "You'd be short a housekeeper," she said lightly, because it was the only way she could handle the closeness of what he was saying. "I don't care about a housekeeper," he said, rough the way his voice got, when he meant something absolutely. "I care about you, about whether you want to stay." He paused. "About whether we're giving you something worth staying for." The kitchen was warm. The bread smell lingered. From upstairs came the faint sound of Bea telling herself a story the way she did at bedtime. "You've been giving me something worth staying for," Maud said, "since the 3rd day." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the big, iron-scarred hand of a man who worked with fire, and held it there. "Then stay," he said. "I intend to," she said. It was not how other people's love stories began. There were no speeches and no grand gestures, only a kitchen and a man who had finally stopped going quiet, and a woman who had waited 2 years for a place in the world that was hers to keep. Maud Sefton had learned to trust the small and solid things, because the small and solid things were what lasted. She had arrived in Iron Hollow with $11 and a story she couldn't disprove. She stayed as Maud Ford, and the town of Iron Hollow, which had shut its doors against her one by one, found over the following months that it had been wrong. She did not make a point of it. She did not crow or hold it over anyone, or say so much as a word to Mrs. Aldrich beyond a civil nod in the dry goods aisle. She simply went on being herself, decent and practical and warm in the ways that mattered, and let the evidence accumulate. Mrs. Aldrich did not recount her story, but she found that it had stopped sticking. There was something about a woman who kept a house well and got up every morning and loved a family fiercely and walked down the main street of Iron Hollow without flinching that was harder to argue with than a whisper campaign. The town, which was not made up entirely of Mrs. Aldrich's, adjusted its opinion gradually and without fanfare, the way a town does when it has been wrong and knows it. Maud noticed. She said nothing about it. She went on setting the table and mending the shirts and listening to the sound of Bea's voice upstairs, and Eli's boots on the porch steps, and the younger boy's laugh coming from the yard, and she found in all of it more than she had ever expected a contract position to give her. Magnus said, at the end of that first year, watching her from across the dinner table with a look he had stopped trying to hide, "I put that notice in Grundy's window and thought no one would come." "I almost didn't," she said. "I'm glad you knocked," he said. His voice was level and certain, the voice of a man who had done a reckoning and arrived at a conclusion he trusted. "So am I," she said, "every day." The children were fed, the house was warm. The fire in the forge burned steady, and the man at the table had come back to himself, slowly, the way warmth comes back to cold iron, and in the house at Iron Hollow, with the lamplight falling soft across the supper table, and the sound of a family at rest all around her, Maud Sefton had found at last the place where she belonged.